on the question of second day Yom Tov and why we observe holidays for 2 days that the Torah says are one day, which is particularly significant, like today, okay? Because today is definitely Yom Tov according to the Torah, and yet anticipating that not many people would come. We are on Zoom. We are without the Hazan tomorrow, which is not actually Yom Tov anymore, although we observe it as Yom Tov. But because Yizkor is recited, we anticipate more people will be there. Hazan will be there, a nice Kiddush afterwards. And it's, I'm preaching to the choir here. There's no point in dumping my frustrations on you because you guys are here. But the whole thing is kind of problematic. But anyway, because of what is going on in Israel the last really day or 2 days, with negotiations once again happening between Israel and Hamas over the possibility of a ceasefire and release of hostages, and frankly, negotiations going on between Israel and Israel on the same topic. Because for those of you who don't follow the Israeli news quite as closely, you have on the one hand Bezalel Smotrich and Yehuda Ben Gavir, who represent the far right of Netanyahu's cabinet, say that if there is a deal reached with Hamas and Rafah is not invaded, they will leave the cabinet and cause the government to fall. On the other hand, Benny Gantz, who was in the opposition prior to the war and has propped up Netanyahu's government since the war, says if they don't reach an agreement, the government has no legitimacy to stay in office, and he will leave. He and his party, which could also cause the government to fall, although also Yair Lapid, who is the head of the opposition, says that if there is an agreement with Hamas, the opposition will prop up the government and keep it in power. So, like I say, there's not only negotiations going on between Israel and Hamas, but there's negotiations going on between Israel and Israel. And so I wanted really to look at some halachic sources on the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvu'im, the mitzvah of redeeming captives. I brought a lot of sources. I'll probably skip some of them because I don't, want to go too long. But let me do a share screen and we'll be able to look at some of those sources. Okay, so here's from the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo from the 1500s. And this is considered the most authoritative code within Orthodox Judaism, and frankly within conservative Judaism too, except where we have, reached rulings that override or supersede this. So Shulchan Aruch Yoridea 252.3. Every moment that one delays unnecessarily the ransoming of a captive, it is as if he were to shed blood. Okay, so, and shed blood means murder. So if you have the opportunity to redeem, it says a cap, well, it says shvu'im in the Hebrew. I'm not sure why the translation says a captive. It's redeem captives. If you have the opportunity to redeem captives and you don't do so, it's like shedding blood. And now Rambam, who's a little earlier, Rambam is Maimonides, illuminates the number of mitzvot that one violates by failing to redeem captives. And by the way, if at any point you have a question, again, because of the share screen, I can't see everybody. So just, unmute yourself and jump in. A person who ignores the redemption of captives transgresses the negative mitzvot. You shall not harden your heart. You shall not shut your hand from your needy fellow. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. He shall not rule harshly over him in your sight. Okay, that is talking about somebody who has been a Jew who has been enslaved by a non-Jew, and you are not allowed to let the non-Jew rule harshly over the Jew. He also fails in the positive mitzvah. You shall surely open your hand unto him, and that your brother may live with you. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, and rescue them that have been taken to die, and many similar ones. There is no greater commandment than redeeming captives. And you see this, the last phrase, from the Hebrew on a lot of signs at various protests in Israel. Ve'ein lecha mitzvah rabbah kefidyon shvu'im. There is no mitzvah greater than redeeming captives. Okay, and again, Shulchan Aruch, Yoredea, the redeeming of captives take precedence to sustaining the poor and clothing them, and there is no mitzvah as great as redeeming captives. Therefore, if one has designated money for any other mitzvah, they can redirect it to redeeming captives. Okay, and what you need to know in looking at this source is that basically money that has been dedicated for one purpose, for one particular mitzvah, cannot be redirected to another mitzvah, right? In other words, if somebody gives money for buying a Sefer Torah, okay, and the community decides, well, buying a Sefer Torah is not necessarily our highest priority. Let's dedicate that mitzvah to feeding poor people instead. You cannot do that. I mean, there is, and I don't want to get into all the details, but there is sort of a priority where the halacha says, yes, this particular mitzvah, because it is so great, you can take money given for one purpose and redirect it to this purpose. But as a general rule, that's not allowed. However, okay, now, right, so if I were to stop here, right, you would conclude that the halacha is very clear that the redemption of captives is like the highest mitzvah possible, and everything should be done to redeem the captives. And that is in general true. However, there are limitations. Okay, so this is clause 4 of the same chapter of Shulchan Aruch. We do not redeem captives for more than their worth because of tikkun olam. Okay, now here I have to say that, tikkun olam, everybody uses tikkun olam now. Basically, tikkun olam means whatever the New York Times editorial page is in favor of. But tikkun olam in the halachic sources actually means the betterment of the world, almost like so that the world proceeds in a orderly way. Okay. So here's the tikkun olam of not redeeming captives for more than they're worth because of tikkun olam, so that our enemies will not devote themselves to kidnapping us. All right. But if you're an individual, you can do whatever you want. And if the person being held captive is a great scholar or has the potential to be a great scholar, then you can redeem them with a large amount of money. Now, I will point out that basically this is a text written by rabbis. So the rabbis say you can redeem rabbis for lots of money, even if you can't redeem ordinary schnooks for lots of money. But the point here is that if the bad guys see that the Jews will pay lots and lots of money to redeem captives, then it now becomes attractive to take people captive, right? And so what you may think you're doing good, but actually you're doing not so good, because what you are doing is you are encouraging the bad guys to capture more Jews, right? And look, I mean, this is an argument that is raised, all right? When Kehilat Shalom, who was a soldier who was taken captive by Hamas years ago, and he was held in captivity for like 5 or 6 years, and then they reached a deal with Hamas, and they released 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for Shalit, among them the guys who planned October 7th, right? So that is, an argument that maybe we don't reach a deal with Hamas, because the deal with Hamas, I mean, it's not simply, we'll cease fire and you guys will release the captives, but we will cease fire, you guys will release the captives, and we will release hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian security prisoners. So, there's an argument to be made. Okay. So in the Talmud, similarly, all right, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it says, the same. We don't redeem captives for more than they're worth. And it also says, you don't help captives escape, also for tikkun ha'olam, right? Because the bad guys will treat the other captives more harshly because some have escaped. And so that is tikkun ha'olam. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says tikkun hashvuim themselves, right? It's for the betterment of the captives. Either way, I mean, the result is the same, that the captives will be treated harshly. However, if there's only one captive, you certainly help them escape. Okay, so any questions or comments on what we've read so far? I mean, I apparently have a question in the comments, so I will lower my hand. So what happens with this thing is if you have your hand up, it assumes you're raising your hand, and so it does it for you. And anyway, any questions or captions on what questions or comments on what we have read so far?
Just a comment.
Yeah,
It
please.
seems to me it would be very hard to decide the value of the person that is a captive, and who makes that decision?
Right. I actually was going to go there, and then I decided not to. But now that you raised the issue, I will go there. I mean, it is a good question, right? Because if it's my spouse or my sibling or my kid who is being held captive, then they have infinite worth, right? On the other hand, if I am a right winger and I recognize, which is true, that most of these hostages are kibbutzniks, right? Which means that they are left wingers. I mean, the great tragedy is that many of the people who had been taken hostage were involved in like shuttling Gazan Palestinians to Israeli hospitals, and peace movements and so on and so forth. So maybe they're not worth very much because the I'm not saying they actively want them to be killed, but they're not really worth very much. I mean, Israel doesn't need so many, you know, leftists, right? But there is actually in these halachic sources, I mean, it's unspoken in what we read, but I mean, it's unspoken because it's actually kind of self-evident to these sources. How do you figure out the worth or the value of the person who is held hostage? You figure out how much they would be sold for if they were being sold as a slave in the market. Okay. And that is because this was a society where slavery existed, right? So, how much would they be sold for as a slave in the market? That's their value. Okay. I mean, similarly, when we read the rabbinic interpretations of what it means an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, right? Which we, first of all, understand it doesn't mean that if somebody pokes out your eye, you poke out their eye. It means the value of an eye, and it's a limitation on punishment. That is to say, it's an eye for an eye, not a life for an eye. Okay. So, how do we figure out the value? Well, okay. If this guy had two eyes and was being sold in the slave market, how much would he be worth? Okay. Now that he has only one eye, how much would he be worth? And that's how you determine the value of, the lost eye. All right. But today, obviously, I mean, determining the value of the captives is
An
much,
actuary.
much harder, right? Because any family member would say infinite, right? But we could also kind of see that, I mean, the last time around, it was 3 Palestinian security prisoners for every hostage. Okay, now it seems to be more like 10, right? And what's the value? I mean, is it 3 for 1? Is it 10 for 1? Is it, as in the case of Gilad Shalit, 1,000 to 1, right? So, I mean, I would say, I'm very happy that it's not me who has to make these decisions. So that's a really good question, because now we don't have sort of an objective measure of, the value of somebody who's being held hostage. All right. There's not any more questions or comments. We'll go to the last 2 sources. And the reason that I'm sharing these 2 is because now these are not ancient sources, these are contemporary halachic sources, but it highlights the different perspectives within Israeli society. Okay, so this is from Avraham Yitzhak Halevi Kilav. There's a halachic journal called Tehumim. Rabbi Kilav is a judge on the Jerusalem Rabbinical Court. a very well-regarded scholar. So here's what Rabbi Kehilat wrote, and this was in 1983, but I would presume he hasn't changed his position. Furthermore, it seems that nowadays, when terrorists declare their desire to kidnap and murder Jews, and in fact act upon these declarations without any compassion for the victims, whether men, women, or children, that releasing terrorists is actual danger and is therefore forbidden. This is true even according to those who maintain that the prohibition is based on the burden imposed on the community, since the danger here is tangible and arises immediately upon their release. Added to this is the fact that they join the forces that battle us from their countries with long-range weaponry, and thus represent a threat even if they don't actually penetrate our borders. Okay, because one of the suggestions is, right, we'll release these people from prison, but not back to Gaza and not back to the West Bank. They would have to go to Tunis or to the Qatar or the UAE or someplace like that. And the argument which Kehilat made, right, 40 years ago, or more than 40 years ago, is that even so, right? I mean, they have weapons and they shoot rockets at us, which they do. It therefore seems that it is forbidden to release terrorists and murderers in exchange for captives, not just in exchange of many terrorists for one Jew, but even one for one, because of the future danger. Okay, however, another source, Rabbi Yuval Sherlow, and Rabbi Sherlow is a very well-regarded rabbi who represents what you might call the more moderate stream of religious Zionism, and, for example, advocates that even though he's strictly Orthodox, that conservative and Reform Jews have, status, receive funding from the government for their shuls and for their activities, that Reform and conservative rabbis should be allowed to officiate at weddings in Israel, and so on and so forth. So from the Orthodox perspective, a moderate and also a moderate on social issues. And so he has a book called Jewish Ethics, and this is what he writes. The impact on the morale of the army could be significant. Once a soldier knows that the state will not do everything it can to free him, including a willingness to release murderers in exchange for his freedom, it will diminish his motivation to fight. Okay, so Sherlow is saying, right, I mean, and this is the argument, and this is frankly why Israel, as a general rule, does agree to these things, right? Is that, I mean, first of all, most of these hostages are not soldiers, but some of them are, right? And people understand, in other words, there's a social contract, right? There's a social contract. The state will do everything it can to take care of its soldiers. And now, in the current situation where the majority of those being held captive, I mean, none of the people released in the first round were soldiers, and none of them were even women of military age, right? They were all either, above military age or kids. And Hamas said, we're not releasing people who are soldiers or potential soldiers. But, the state has a social contract to protect its people, right? And frankly, that social contract broke down on October 7th, right? I mean, not only that the state failed to prevent the attack, but I mean, people were calling for help, right? People who were, locked up in their homes, in their safe rooms, in there for hours and hours. And, hours and hours, and the army didn't respond, the army didn't come, right? To the point where there are stories of, there was this one kibbutznik who called his father, who was a retired general. And his father got two friends, and they got their arms and they drove to the kibbutz, and they rescued this family and many others. So that social contract really broke down. So I think you could make the argument from Rabbi Shurla's perspective that this is something that the state owes its people, especially because that social contract broke down. So we'll see. I mean, I wanted to present halachic sources, not to have a political discussion, so I will not share my perspective on what should happen, nor will I share my perspective on what actually will happen. I will tell you that my sense of what should happen and what my sense of what actually will happen is not the same thing, but we will see. And again, if there's any comments or questions, please jump in. All right, and if not, we'll stop the recording.